It was a cold, foggy night when I decided to visit the cemetery. Something about the solitude and silence of that place always attracted me, even though most people would avoid cemeteries at night. As I walked among the graves, I spotted an imposing mausoleum isolated in the farthest corner. It was old, with rusted iron doors and walls covered in moss. Something inside me urged me to go in, as if an invisible force was calling me. As I opened the mausoleum door, a damp, decaying smell filled the air. The moonlight trickled weakly through the small windows, revealing a dark and claustrophobic space. My heart started racing, but I kept walking. The inner walls were adorned with old portraits and engravings of people who had apparently been buried there. The feeling that I wasn't alone grew stronger, but there was no one visible except for me. Suddenly I heard a low, dragging sound coming from the back of the mausoleum. It was as if something was moving slowly, scraping against the stone floor. My first reaction was to run, but something kept me in place as if I were paralyzed. When I finally managed to move, I walked slowly and cautiously toward the back, where a tombstone seemed to be slightly out of place, tilted to one side. Holding my breath, I bent down to examine the tombstone. The dragging sound continued, now closer and more intense. It was as if something were trying to get out from underground. I ran my hand over the tombstone and felt a slight vibration, as if something were moving beneath it. Fear took over, but I couldn't pull my hand away from the stone. Suddenly the vibration stopped, and an absolute silence took over the place. For a second I thought it was all over, that my mind was just playing tricks on me. But then I felt a presence beside me, as if someone was standing there, watching my every move. I looked to the side and saw a tall, indistinct shadow, a figure that seemed to stare at me with eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. My breathing grew heavy and the shadow drew closer. Not knowing what to do, I backed away slowly, my eyes fixed on that presence, but the figure seemed to follow my every move, as if it were feeding off my fear. Then I heard a voice, low and whispering, coming from within the shadow. It called me by name. A cold chill ran down my spine. I had never told anyone about my visit to the cemetery that night. Shaking, I turned to leave the mausoleum, but the door, which had been open before, was now shut. I was trapped inside with that thing. Banging on the door, I screamed for help, but the cemetery's silence absorbed my cries. I looked back and saw that the figure had disappeared, but something told me it hadn't left. The mausoleum seemed to pulse as if it were alive. After a few minutes of desperation, I heard heavy footsteps outside. Someone was coming toward me. I backed away from the door, hoping it was a cemetery worker. But to my horror, when the door finally opened, the same shadowy figure appeared on the other side, now laughing in a low, menacing way. It was as if it were amused by my fear, as if I were just another victim in its collection. In the final moment, just before leaving, I felt a cold, invisible hand grab my shoulder, as if trying to pull me back. I struggled against that force and ran out of the mausoleum, feeling as if something was still watching me, waiting for my return. Since then, I've never returned to the cemetery at night. Every small town has its legends, and in mine it was the old mausoleum in the abandoned cemetery. They said something dark and forgotten lurked inside. One night, driven by an odd and almost irrational curiosity, I decided to go there. It felt like something was drawing me in, a silent, irresistible call I couldn't ignore. The path to the cemetery was shrouded in thick fog, making each step feel heavier. The atmosphere was unsettling, as if the shadows held dark secrets. Finally, the dark outline of the mausoleum appeared among the gravestones, with its ancient doors slightly ajar, as if waiting for my arrival. As I approached, a chill ran through my body. The silence was absolute, broken only by the muffled sound of the wind. It felt as if the air itself was heavy with something that shouldn't be there. Looking inside, the darkness was dense, and I had the strange feeling of being watched. Using my phone's flashlight, I illuminated the interior. There were dusty urns, but what really caught my attention was a figure carved into the wall, a disfigured face in stone, with empty eyes that seemed to stare at me. With each step, an invisible pressure increased, as if the space itself was closing in around me. Suddenly, a low, dragging sound echoed off the walls, as if something was moving in the shadows. I looked around, trying to pinpoint the source, but my flashlight flickered, failing more and more. That's when I realized I wasn't alone in that place. I felt a dense, threatening presence. The sound seemed to get closer, growing more intense, like a deep, grotesque whisper. My skin prickled as I realized the sound wasn't behind me, but beside me, so close that I could almost feel a cold breath on my neck. I tried not to look, but a morbid curiosity forced me to slowly turn. In the dim light, I saw a hooded figure motionless with a dark, empty face where its eyes should have been. It stared at me intently, projecting a silent terror that froze me in place. My mind screamed to run, but my body felt locked, as if the darkness itself was holding me there. Finally, I gathered the strength to take a step back, trying to leave. But as I did, I felt something cold touch my shoulder. It wasn't a human hand. It was something that seemed to cling to me, a chilling presence that felt like it was saying I couldn't leave. A low, distorted laughter echoed in the space. With one final effort, I broke free from that icy grip and ran toward the door. As soon as I stepped out, the door slammed shut, almost as if the mausoleum itself were furious, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I looked back, and for a split second, saw the hooded figure in the fogged glass of the door smiling menacingly. Since that night, I feel as if something has been following me. To this day, I avoid going near the cemetery, and the icy cold of that hand remains imprinted on my skin, a dark reminder that I should never have entered that place. It was a sunny, cloudless day when I decided to explore the old cemetery on the outskirts of town. It felt odd visiting such a dark place in broad daylight, but something drew me there. The cemetery's silence at noon was surreal, as if nature refused to disturb the dead's rest. In the center, I spotted a stone mausoleum, its entrance slightly open, as if awaiting a visitor. As I approached, I felt a chilly breeze cut through the warm air. The contrast was so strange it gave me goosebumps. I looked around, but there was no one else. Only the mausoleum, towering against the clear sky. Gathering my courage, I stepped inside, letting the daylight partially illuminate the interior. Shadows danced on the walls, forming indistinct shapes that seemed to watch my every step. Inside the mausoleum, the air was thick and smelled of mold. Daylight couldn't fully penetrate, casting shadows in every direction. The wall in front of me had ancient inscriptions, nearly erased by time. When I touched them, I felt a tingling sensation, as if some energy was trapped there. Just then, I heard a faint whisper, almost imperceptible, echoing through the empty space. The whisper grew louder, turning into a sort of endless murmur. I looked around, trying to locate the sound's source, but it was impossible. The walls seemed to be whispering, a distant and sad melody. I tried to ignore it, but the voices grew more intense, saying something I couldn't understand. My heart began to race, and the mausoleum seemed to close in around me. Then I noticed something strange. The shadow of a still figure at the back of the mausoleum. It didn't move, just watched. I took a step back, trying to stay calm, but I felt like I was being watched by invisible eyes. Even in daylight, the place felt steeped in darkness. I tried to rationalize, but the shadow remained there, unchanged, as if it were waiting for something. Suddenly, I felt a cold touch on my shoulder. I turned quickly, but no one was there, only emptiness and absolute silence. The air seemed to vibrate, as if time itself were trapped inside the mausoleum. I felt a presence behind me, and when I looked back at the shadow, it had disappeared. Fear began to take over, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. Then I heard soft footsteps echoing across the stone floor. Each step came closer, until they stopped right behind me. My body froze, and I felt a cold breath on my neck. Something or someone was there, but I couldn't see it. The sensation of being watched was suffocating, and daylight seemed unable to dispel the darkness surrounding me. The sense of danger was undeniable. I decided to leave, but as I tried to take a step, it felt as though something invisible held my feet, preventing my escape. The mausoleum door seemed further away with every second. I mustered all my strength and broke free. I ran outside, breathing the warm air, but still feeling the cold touch on my skin. Even under the sun, I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. I looked back before leaving the cemetery, and for the last time I saw a shadowy figure standing at the mausoleum entrance, watching me. Its face was covered by shadows, but I knew it was smiling. The image was seared into my mind. Since then, I have never returned to that place, but sometimes I still feel as if something is watching me from afar, waiting for the right moment to approach again. It was an eerily calm afternoon when young John, a 10-year-old boy, ventured into the old cemetery near his house. He couldn't explain why, but something seemed to call him there. The silence was so thick it muffled even the sound of his footsteps. Amidst the gravestones he spotted the old mausoleum, its doors slightly open as if waiting for him. As he approached the mausoleum, John felt a sudden chill, as if the place was wrapped in cold air despite the warmth of the afternoon. He hesitated, but curiosity drove him to enter. The interior was dark, with shadows moving slightly on the walls. He took a step and the creak of the stone floor echoed like a warning. Inside the mausoleum, the light was scarce, and the air smelled strongly of dampness and age. John looked around, noticing the walls with ancient inscriptions and figures that seemed to follow his movements. He began reading a phrase carved into the stone, but stopped when he heard a faint whisper. The whisper turned into a low, almost inaudible voice, which seemed to call him by name. John shivered, but he couldn't move. The voice continued, repeating his name softly and slowly until he murmured, "Who's there?" Silence answered, but a sense of presence lingered in the air. Suddenly he saw a shadow at the back of the mausoleum. The figure looked like a man, but it was impossible to make out his face. John tried to step back, but his feet seemed glued to the floor. The figure remained still, just watching him, and he felt as if he was being scrutinized. When he finally managed to move, John took a step back, but the shadow advanced a little. The boy felt a weight on his chest, as if the air had grown dense. Amidst the silence, he heard the figure murmur, "Why are you here, John?" He couldn't answer. He was paralyzed by fear. John tried to explain that he had been drawn there, but the words wouldn't come out. The figure extended a hand toward him, and the temperature dropped even more. Its fingers were long and thin, almost translucent. "Go back to where you came from," said the voice, and the cold emanating from the figure was so intense it felt like the entire mausoleum would freeze. Terrified, John turned around and ran toward the exit. His footsteps echoed off the walls, and he could swear he heard the voice repeating, "Go back, go back." He left the mausoleum feeling the warmth of the afternoon again, but still trembling, as if the cold was clinging to his skin. Before leaving the cemetery, John looked back and saw the shadow standing at the mausoleum entrance, watching him. He felt a shiver, but also a strange curiosity. Perhaps one day he would return, but deep down, he knew that place held secrets he should never uncover.